Friends of the Children is a professional mentoring organization intentionally serving the children facing the most challenging circumstances. We commit to standing by each child and their family for 12.5 years, no matter what. Literacy is one of the most powerful protective factors a young person can have, but our children are falling far behind. In a few minutes, we'll look at some of the distressing statistics, but the bottom line is that we are depriving our children, particularly children of color, living in poverty, of their futures, and we're all paying the price. I'll be exploring the topic today with 3 brilliant and compelling experts. Dr. Doug Bolton has been a licensed clinical psychologist for over 20 years and is the director of school consultation for formative psychological services. He provides consultation to parents, educators, and clinicians throughout Northern Illinois to create trauma-responsive communities that help foster student and staff resilience. Welcome, Doug.
Great to be here, Tal. Thank you.
Dr. Dwayne B. Davis has spent almost 3 decades teaching, leading, coaching, and consulting at a variety of schools and organizations in Chicago and nationally. He is a former Chicago Public Schools teacher, former leader and faculty member of City Colleges of Chicago, and a born and bred Southsider who cares deeply about the experience of our students in the city, nationally and globally. He is currently consulting with organizations locally and nationally on a variety of literacy, equity, and program evaluation projects through his company, Raising Expectations. Welcome, Dwayne.
So glad to be here with you today and with everyone in the audience.
And finally, we are delighted to have Marcos Gonzalez here. He is the program director at the Chicago Resiliency Network, an initiative of the Corporate Coalition of Chicago. He assists in workforce development programming, leading efforts to create more trauma-informed and healing-centered workplaces. Before that, he was the director of trauma-informed education at the Chicago Jesuit Academy. He brings a breadth of experience in both the nonprofit and education sectors and a passion for advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. He earned his Master of Social Work at Loyola University. Welcome, Marcos.
Great to be with you all.
I am delighted that you all are here. And now let's get started. A recent Sun-Times article celebrated Chicago Plug students' gains in reading. Hip, hip, hooray. And yes, it's wonderful that we're making gains, but let's be loud and clear about how abysmal the reality is. These are the gains that we're celebrating. Only 12.2% of low-income students and 12% of Black students are reading on track by the end of 3rd grade. Based on these stats, one can extrapolate that if a child is both low income and Black, their statistics are even worse. We see that reality with the children in our program. Friends of the Children serves children who live on Chicago's south and west sides in the neighborhoods most impacted by poverty and gun violence. When we tested them last summer, before we started an in-house literacy program, the data was alarming. 88% of the youth in our program were reading significantly below grade level. In a shocking 83% of our 6th graders were only reading at a kindergarten to 2nd grade level. Why in the world would a 2nd grader reading at a kindergarten level or even a 2nd grade level keep going to school? It is imperative that children read at grade level by the time they enter 4th grade. At that point, illiteracy creates a significant barrier to success in school. On-track reading by the end of 3rd grade has been identified as a key indicator of a child's likelihood to graduate from high school. Literacy opens a child's world. When a child is literate, school is a welcoming place where they can learn and flourish. But when a child struggles to read and is left behind, school becomes alienating. To compensate for an inability to read, children will often act out, disrupt, disengage, and ultimately drop out. If a child doesn't feel welcome at school, they'll seek a welcoming place elsewhere. They become prime targets for gang recruitment, who are more than happy to make the child feel welcome and valued for exactly who they are today. It's not hard to see how illiteracy becomes a direct pipeline to violence and incarceration. 85% of youth involved in the courts are illiterate. If you cannot read and write, your options in life are severely limited. 70% of Americans who are incarcerated cannot read at a 4th grade level. In Illinois, the cost to incarcerate a youth for 1 year is nearly $200,000. There are countless other ways to measure the economic costs. Lower literacy rates directly correlate to higher unemployment rates, reduced income, and overall impacts the US competitiveness on the global stage. The cost of illiteracy is far more than economic. It is a moral failing. Success in school, employment, and life is utterly dependent on the ability to read and write. We cannot deny that right to Chicago's children. There are 2 things that today's discussion is not about. The first is early childhood education programs. We know that it is ideal for children to have high quality early childhood and academic support. The challenge is that early childhood programming is contingent on active caregiver engagement. What about the children whose caregivers can't, don't, or won't engage in early childhood programs? Far, far too many children and families are being missed by early childhood programs. We need a plan to support those children. In high quality education, every child needs fantastic teachers, an evidence-based curriculum, access to books, and books that have characters that look like them. But a high quality teacher and curriculum is a necessary but not sufficient condition for a child to learn. What we want to explore today is what I call baseline humanitarian support. All children need baseline humanitarian support to be in a brain state to learn. The vast majority of us on this call today grew up with baseline humanitarian support. We were so supported and secure that it's hard to imagine that some children are missing this vital precondition to learning. Why aren't children learning how to read? And what can we do about it? That's why we brought these 3 wonderful panelists to talk with us today. I'd like to start by talking with you, Marcos. Remote learning during the pandemic did not work for most children, especially those living in poverty. However, based on the statistics of the number of children involved in juvenile detention and those in prison, it's clear that we've been failing to teach children how to read for a very long time. Why is that? What did we do wrong? And let me be even more direct. What's wrong with these children that they can't learn how to read?
Yeah, thank you so much for that great introduction, Tal, and for that rich question. You know, as you frame that question, right, one of the things that both my experience of working with folks, young folks in juvenile detention, as well as working within schools, is, you know, trying to shift that language from thinking about what's wrong with you to what happened to you, right? I know we'll probably talk some more about that in today's conversation, but thinking about the way in which, you know, our brain formation and how young folks are in their early development, right? When they're in heightened stress and in environments that are suboptimal for learning, you then are impacted, right? In that process of being able to develop these skills. And that only becomes more exacerbated when we are faced with, you know, the adverse experiences of becoming involved in the criminal legal system, of, you know, the realities of what happens, in particular when I think about the in and out, that revolving door that is pulling students away from the classroom, away from these environments where they could be learning, and shifting towards environments that are not created to serve our learning brains.
Thank you. Dwayne, can you just chime in here? Like, why aren't kids learning how to read?
Well, I mean, it's one of those big philosophical, esoteric questions. In some ways, right? There's kind of a superstructure and systemic way to think about it, and then there's the pragmatic way. I said earlier to the group, I spent my day with some kindergartners today, right? And just sitting on a floor with some young people talking about who helps them in their community and who their favorite community helpers were, right? And I didn't think that's what I was going to do today before we got on this panel, but it's really key to hear like young people say, kindergartners, to say like, doctors and hospital people are like important and my favorite community workers. A lot of them said police officers are their favorite community workers, grocery store owners, builders, right? Like, so like at a very, very young age, like what's really important to young people is that people are in community with them and that people care about them, right? And so that is something that we try to put a lot of emphasis on school providing a large percentage of that for young people, when really it is the job where all hands on deck need to be there. So that baseline humanitarian support that you speak about, for me, is how do all the pieces work together in order to support all of the humans that go inside of school buildings, go to park districts, go to food depositories, go to libraries, right? So for me, I'm plus 100ing what Marco said, which is like, how do we create conditions so the community is ready? And that is what will make young people ready when they show up to school, and show up to school to learn, and with the things that we're setting to the side that we know need to be there for all of our young people.
So we're jumping ahead. I want to slow us down for one moment, right? So many kids live in really stressful and challenging circumstances. So at home, they may not have a home. They may not have a bed. They may have seen someone beaten up at home last night. They may have heard a gunshot or seen a gunshot last night. Doug, I'm wondering if you can explain to us, what does it mean for a child to be ready to learn? And like in the simplest terms, can you explain to us how trauma and brain states impact a child's readiness to learn? And we have a graphic to help you explain.
Yeah, I'll do my best. In order for our brains, in order for us to learn, our nervous system needs to be telling us that we're safe. And what happens in our lives is our brains are constantly taking information that says I'm safe or not safe. If I'm safe, the good news is that my brain goes into homeostasis and I can fully engage. But if I'm not safe, then my limbic system triggers my stress response. That triggers my nervous system to say I've got to fight, flight, or fight or flee primarily, or freeze. We can shut down and become dissociated. And so the goal, in order for any of us to learn, we need to be emotionally regulated. We need to be in a place where our brains say that we're safe. And that's the key thing to our brains. We believe that our brains are built for rational thinking, but first our brains are built for survival. And so first, our brain is constantly scanning the environment to say, am I safe? And what you can see on the right side of this, when you've experienced developmental trauma, so much of your brain's energy is needing to determine whether or not I'm safe. And you can see at the very top, there's very little energy, very little cognitive space, bandwidth to be able to engage in high level thinking. And we can think about that in our own lives. If we are going through a divorce, or if a family member has died or is very sick, how hard it is for us to focus on our work because our nervous system is so activated. With typical development, because we don't have to worry about survival, and you referenced this earlier, Tal, many of us didn't have to have this focus on our own survival. And so our brains were free to roam and explore and learn. And the last thing that I'll say, and Bruce Perry talks about this, he's a beautiful writer and researcher on trauma. And what he says is that in order to access our best brains, in order to access reason, we need to be emotionally regulated and connected in relationship. And that's both of these things are impacted by traumatic events. Our relationships are impacted and our ability to emotionally regulate. And so our work in opening kids' brains up is to engage them in a healthy, safe relationship and to be emotionally regulated so we can help them emotionally regulate, quiet that nervous system so they can access their full brain.
Thank you. So in Friends of the Children Speak, we talk about the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain. And the downstairs brain, we all need to feel safe and secure before we can access that upstairs part of our brain where learning and cognition happens. And so, Dwayne, given that a child needs to gain access to their upstairs brain in order to learn, how do we help them access it? What does baseline humanitarian support look like? And what role do, you alluded to this earlier, do relationships, trust, and a sense of belonging play in helping a child access the upstairs part of their brain?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that and asking that question. And one of the first things that came to my mind was Goldie Muhammad's work about genius and joy, and that the adults that are around young people have to believe that they have genius and also want to set up the conditions so they feel joy and bring that genius and joy to their entire lives. Now, we're talking about young people, and you mentioned the challenges and Doug's commentary about how the brain reacts to trauma and what that means. And as a young person shows up to any space, whatever space that is, one, it's about assuming positive intent and not having that blame behavior. You mentioned that earlier, like, why can't you learn? And as Marco says, well, why aren't you ready to learn? And how can I help you get ready to learn? And what does that look like? And one of my if anybody's ever talked to me, talks about this, is that you pull one thread in education and the whole kind of thing unravels, because you look at what root causes are and you say, did you have a healthy meal? Did you have a safe route to school? And not that you need safe passage workers to get there, that they're not people designated to keep you safe, but that you can get there without a safe passage worker in our city of Chicago, for people that are here joining us from outside of our city. Do you have universal basic income? The impact of maternal health on young people, right? That if a mother, a caregiver, any caregiver, has a roof over their head, has either universal basic income or had a household income to take care of their family, then a young person is not worried about if they're going to get evicted, where they're going to sleep that night, whether they're going to be able to have a meal. So what does that baseline support look like to get all humans prepared and ready to learn? And how do we, as community members, as adults, as society, how do we figure out how that looks at the K level to the 12th grade level to the humane level of all humans having that access?
Thank you. Marcos, I think, can you just chime in also? Like, what role do relationships, trust, and a sense of belonging have in learning?
They're so critical. And I appreciate Doug's comments on, drawing from Bruce Perry's work, because that's very much kind of what's informed a lot of my experiences in working with young people who, in one of his studies, he looked at like a 24-hour period and looked at a relationship map and what are the number of positive interactions that a young person might have, right? And we can all think about this in light of the pandemic, when we were isolated from one another, what that did to everyone's mental health in terms of that impact. Now you take that to an experience of young folks who are also dealing with a heightened levels of stress, right? And without that positive relationship, right, that importance of relationship on co-regulation, on what happens when we are, losing access of that, upstairs brain, right? Without these positive interactions, positive relationships, and, to go back to the earlier question around people who, who are unfortunately system impacted, right? Do they have a positive relationship to school when school can be such a punitive environment, right? As Dwayne was saying, I'm being punished for not being able to read as if it was my fault that I don't have access to my upstairs brain. And so if we were to shift that narrative, right, to think, is school a safe space, or better yet, what are safe spaces? Is going home a safe space? And if a young person doesn't have that environment, at what point will they be able to open a book and start to read if they can't find that safe space, that safe relationship in order to be able to engage that practice?
Doug,
Yeah, and if I could jump in real quick, because that part about, like, does a young person, you just track a young person's day in a building, right? That cycle. And I've had to do this as an educator and encourage other people to do it. See how many people call that student by their name. See how many people ask that young person how they're doing today, right? And as soon as you get that observation and reaction, and as a social worker, psychologist, teacher, person that works with kids, we are keen observers of human behavior. And we see something, oh, your normal, your whatever your solid state, your regular like stasis is, when you're a little bit off, I recognize that because I see you every day. I say something to you, I recognize your humanity. So that's part of that sense of belonging too. I'm sorry, I want to say that.
Thank you. No, thank you. It's so important. So Doug, I wonder if you can just help us wrap up this question before we go on to the next one. But really, how does a relationship help someone move from their downstairs brain to the upstairs brain? Like, I'm not giving them housing. I'm not like, how does a relationship do that? What does a relationship provide?
So it has to be a regulating, connected relationship, right? That not any relationship will do it. But what we know is that if we want that, the most powerful way to regulate ourselves is to be co-regulated. We regulate in relationship. And by creating these relationships, what it does is it says, because we are both our brains are survival organs, but they're also very social organs. And what happens is when we realize we're in a safe, supportive relationship, it allows our nervous system to quiet, accessing our full brain. It's like the elevator that you need to get from the first floor to the top floor.
Perfect. Thank you. Marcos, I want to go back to you because you touched upon this. And I think it's really, what is the connection between children misbehaving or acting out in the classroom, punishment and discipline, and then learning in general? Like, how is it currently working and how would you like to see it work?
Yeah, we, can look at, again, the essence of school policies or, procedures on, what happens when you come into the classroom and you didn't do your homework, right? To go back to, what both Doug and Dwayne were mentioning, I don't have a home that has a desk or an environment that I can do that. Again, to come back into the classroom and to experience punitive responses to some realities. And again, we go back to that earlier question of what's wrong with you versus what happened to you. Like, what happened last night that you weren't able to complete your homework, right? And all of these patterns, right, can start to feed into each other, into themselves of punitive policies, students, not accessing their upstairs brain, right? When they go that amygdala hijack their downstairs brain, that heightened stress state, and there's not that co-regulation, thinking about the importance of that relationship between a teacher and a student. Think about how teachers might also be dysregulated themselves, right? The likelihood of, students acting out and us responding to the behavior as opposed to responding to the student can lead to then that student getting taken out of the classroom, learning, they're missing more learning time, right? Students being suspended or at times expelled, right? All of this is impacting their learning journey because it's taking them away from that environment. And so, it connects back to the critical importance of some of these positive relationships. And, again, is it a teacher? Is it a mentor? Is it a teacher's aide? I mean, there's a lot of different people within a student's daily life that can be a positive connection. But if the student doesn't have that or can't find that within their learning environment, it can potentially lead to, again, more removal from the classroom that's going to take them away from their learning, that optimal learning zone.
Thank you. Doug, anything you want to add to that about sort of discipline and punishment and children acting out?
Well, I love what Marcos shared. And I guess the thing for me, when we think about dysregulation, oftentimes the triggers of that are feeling disconnected, feeling devalued, and feeling powerless. And the challenge is that the things that we do to respond to trauma-based behavior exacerbate the impact of trauma. They don't make it better because what punishments typically do is they devalue, they disconnect, and they disempower. And so we are further dysregulating the brain that we want to have more active. And that's one of the things that I really worry about. And what happens is just as regulation is contagious through co-regulation, dysregulation is wildly contagious too. And whether you're a mentor or a teacher in a classroom with 25 people, it's very easy for us then as adults to seek control. And the way we do that is often through punishment. taking things away, removing people, removing it, because it gives us a temporary sense of control. But in the long run, what it does is it undermines the sense that this is a safe place for learning. And I guess I'll just add one more thing. I had this, I can't remember where I heard this. It's not original, but the idea is that imagine at home, if kids are experiencing trauma and it's like there's a grizzly bear in their home, their body is responding in that way. And then all of a sudden they come to school, which is a place where they experience shame and punishment and exclusion. It's like they're going back and there's a grizzly bear in the corner of that classroom too. And what we want to do is give kids as much time where they've got less stress as opposed to more stress.
Thank you. I wanted to I just realized there's a wonky term that we're talking about, regulated and dysregulated, and that isn't regular English. And dysregulated is if someone's feeling really stressed out, and regulated is if someone feeling calm, sort of safe and secure. Dwayne,
Yeah, I'd say regulated is the upstairs brain, right? We can just
upstairs brain,
the upstairs brain, and dysregulated is when you're in downstairs brain.
Downstairs. Right, exactly. So Dwayne, I'd like to turn to you now and ask, is it realistic to expect that schools alone can teach children how to read and write? It seems to me that having one teacher teach 25 kids who live in extreme poverty and therefore really hard lives is not going to be conducive to ensuring that the kids are in a brain state to learn. So what role can community organizations like Friends of the Children play in ensuring that children are able to access their right to read?
Well, the first part of the question, I was just going to say, it is not realistic. No, not realistic. Next question.
Yeah.
But also on the bigger, in the bigger picture, I think there are a couple of things I want to tag back to the last question a little bit to say what wellness looks like, what looking at your health in a proactive way as opposed to a reactive way, what comorbidities look like, right? And that dysregulation increases your blood pressure, changes your diet, does all of those things that impact you. And then you show up to a school and you're saying the teacher is the sage on the stage that's going to fix the problem, right? And that is just, that's just, it's not realistic. It's not realistic for a lot of different reasons. So I've been a staunch proponent of community literacy. And I think one of my good friends and partners in the struggle, Kim Bigger, is here from the Barbara Bush Foundation, and having an idea or a lens about how libraries, how park districts, how nonprofit organizations, churches, barbershops, grocery stores, doctors' offices, how all of these spaces are literacy spaces. And in the original flyer for this panel, it talks about illiteracy, and people are very literate. People are very smart. Humans are very smart. Young people are super smart. They use supercomputers like every day to do a lot of interesting, strange things that are mostly positive, right? Get a bad rap for the technology. But the idea that we have young people and adults and people that have been formerly incarcerated who have levels of literacy, low levels of literacy academically, high levels of funds of knowledge and functional literacy on how to get around the world, how to fix a car, how to do something. So we all have to figure out a way to work together. And we also can't wait for somebody else to help us do it. We have to network ourselves. We have to be in spaces like this and figure out how we can coordinate and communicate and deliver the mail to the right address, get the resources to the young people and the families and the caregivers that need it the most.
Thank you. Doug, anything to add here?
And I could listen to these guys all day. So thank you, Dwayne. That was beautiful. I guess what I would, for me, what I say is that, there's a person I really like who talks about self-regulation. His name is Stuart Shanker. He's got a book out called Self-Reg. And what he talks about is misbehavior is stress behavior. And he talks about the kinds of stresses that dysregulate us. And the things that the biological stresses, social stresses, cognitive stresses, emotional stresses, all of these things. When kids walk into school, especially when they're walking into school from chaotic neighborhoods and chaotic homes, it can be overwhelming for them. And so their brain they often spend the entire school day in downstairs brain. And I guess what I would say is the remarkable opportunity that Friends of the Children has is being able to Number one, create the connection that allows to move into upstairs brain, right? To co-regulate. The other thing it does is it allows us to take away all those other stresses, to open their brains up for learning so they can access the learning that they may not be able to access within a several hundred student school building or in their living room that may be chaotic. That being able to figure out how can we find these pockets of time. And the thing that I love about Friends is that it's not just you give them a heavy dose of emotional connected regulation during the week, and you do it for 12 and a half years. I don't know anybody else who does that, but those doses mean something. Those doses make sense. Those doses transform lives. So I guess that to me is why I love Friends of the Children, because of the opportunity that it provides for these kids to get these oases, allows their nervous system to quiet, allows their brain to access both relationship and learning.
Thank you. And what you touched upon, Doug, one of our participants, Dan, I saw you had a comment in the chat that we don't know when obstacles are going to come up in children's life. We don't know when hardship is going to show up. There isn't sort of a magic quick solution that if we just give them a 6-month program and we love upon these kids for 6 months, poof, everything's good and everything's going to be fine. And that's why that in-depth, long-term support is really necessary. I do want to encourage you, if you have questions, feel free to write them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. I think that I want to come to a question from another one of the participants, from Karen, that she wants to know, how do we work with teachers to help them learn and to deeply understand the concepts of regulation and dysregulation? And is it realistic to expect that of teachers? So Marcos, let's bring you into this conversation also, and just who wants to answer that question about how do we teach teachers about regulation and dysregulation? And is that a realistic expectation of teachers when they have that whole core curriculum to teach as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it was something that I felt very grateful for the work that I was doing at Chicago Gifted Academy in terms of thinking about not just a trauma-informed classroom, but a trauma-informed school, and that relationship in terms of supporting teachers, right, becomes so critical. And any educator during the pandemic felt that the constant shift of policies. Are we virtual? Are we in person? Are we hybrid? And the number of educators who are leaving the profession at that time. And I'm an eternal optimist and always like to think that we can create systems, right, that can support everyone's thriving, right? But it's to say, the systems are working as we create them. So as a school administrator, to be able to think through, well, how are we providing supports to teachers that's going beyond just a cupcake or pizza in the break room, but providing mental health spaces for them, resources like increased access to mental health therapy, things that can help teachers regulate both before and after they're entering the classroom. Right. One of the things that I was really fortunate, I think, at our school was, teachers to have access to gym space. That a critical importance of our own physical movement. Right. We've incorporated different types of body movement. Right. That's another way to access that, moving the elevator, as Doug was saying, that downstairs brain to the upstairs brain. But as you mentioned, Tal, teachers are already working on grading. They're working on lesson planning. They're working on, extra co-curriculars or extracurriculars. All of these different elements on top of their own personal lives, right? The things that they might be carrying in, like, teachers' lives don't stop when they, enter the classroom. So considering all of those facts, as an eternal optimist, yes, I believe it's possible, but we have to, I think about how we're creating better capacity for teachers. And not every school has the resources to do that. And so that's, I think, a broader question. How can we develop some more of those resources to be supporting our educators?
And I'll just
another question, go ahead.
Jump in on coaching teachers and creating school cultures. This is a work culture circumstance, right? It's all work, right? And I like to equate educators with healthcare workers in that same way. That educators and healthcare workers, people that work in schools and hospitals and care spaces, have to show up every day, because the humans will show up every day. They're going to show up sick. They're going to show up well. They're going to show up maybe with just a broken finger, but sometimes with a gunshot wound. They're going to show up having eaten or not eaten, and you still have to show up and have a level of consistency of care and understanding in that space. And then you also have to care for yourself and have understanding for yourself in that space. And when you send a 21-year-old or even a 65-year-old into that space who has dysregulation in their own life, they're from those same communities, we're still going back to the idea that the whole community has to rally around this idea that the spaces people show up to have to be spaces of care and belonging and community first. We'll teach them how to read and teach them how to do math. That's going to happen. But we have to be very confident that we have to do as much as we can in the time that we have, but start with care first.
I'm going to sneak into sort of two other questions from the crowd, and then we'll sort of do a wrap-up question. But someone wrote me sort of technology. Isn't technology the answer? There's really good apps out there that we can really give kids more reading exercises. And isn't that just going to teach them how to read? What's their answer to technology?
Well, I'll jump in. I'm not in no way am I an expert on technology or social media or any of that stuff. But here's what I will say. That as long as humans have been learning, it's been social. And if we and being social opens our brains up. So I think that there can be apps, and the thing that a lot of apps can do is they can capture the dopamine circuits in the brain to get kids to engage. But we can't lose sight of the fact that learning is social. It's social in groups. It's social one-to-one. And if we, there. Oh, sorry, am I back? That we can't,
well, we, Doug, we're going to stop you because you're breaking up.
Okay.
I'll jump in on the tech side because I think tech, I am
Wayne
not.
or Marcos, do you guys want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll go. That the technology, people thought the same thing, that the radio was going to like destroy reading. And then the TV was going to like destroy the family, right? That they're all, every time we have an innovation, we then have to figure out how that innovation, how we're going to incorporate that innovation into what we do and then decide.
Yeah, I want to add one comment on this because I think I want to go back to that importance of the, adult who's might be handing an iPad or handing, a device to a young person. And it goes back to the importance of co-regulation, right? If a parent doesn't have the capacity themselves, might lean on technology as the caregiver, right? We can't allow for that replacement to kind of take its place. It's so critical to have that shared time. Now, like you say, it's an additive tool, but it cannot be a replacement tool to how a young person can benefit from, utilizing that in their learning journey. Dr. Davis, there's a great question in here for you. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the role of basic income, because I think this is a really rich and important part of our conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was seeing how long ago I was going to answer in the chat.
Yeah.
Because we had this happen, right? So during the pandemic, I think many people probably on this call were informed like we're going to need families to get access, and I automatically talked to people and said, do not presume everyone has the internet in their house. So if you send them with a laptop, they're still going to need a Wi-Fi connection, a Wi-Fi device. And I just started talking about Wi-Fi as if it was water, right? You do not shut off water in a home, right? If you shut off the water, the place is uninhabitable. And we're at the point where if you shut off someone's internet, that place is inhabitable. They can't work. They can't go to school. They can't go to the doctor, right? There are many things you can't do. And I just started saying to people, the internet is water. The internet is water. So if you are housing insecure, if you are living in a shelter, if you are always moving around the couch surfing with your child, with your significant other, with the people that depend on you, that is what keeps the technology from being something that is automatically accessible, right? There's a hardware issue, there's a software issue, there's an access issue. And interestingly enough, the technology in the city of Chicago, and I think this is a regular kind of challenge everywhere, is that now we have more vacant lots. And because we don't have population density, we have spaces that have low levels of technological access because of our lack of density, whereas in other countries where they're highly dense, it's too many people accessing those spaces and all that time. So to me, that connection of technology and income has something to do with housing insecurity, has something to do with having the internet, having a device, and then having a learning device, not just a device, a flat device, a computer where you can access the things that the school or someone's put in there for you.
Thank you. And I apologize for the technical challenges that we had here. Okay, panelists, I'm shifting up this last question on you all a bit. If we wanted the people on this call to walk away with just two things that they understand, right? Like 12% of Black children in Chicago, 12% of low-income children are on-track reading. That's abysmal, right? Marcos, you told us, don't think what's wrong with them. Let's say what happened to them. What are two things that you would want the people on this call to take away, to know that's going to make a difference to ensure that that children in our city can access their right to read? So who wants to go first?
I'll give it a go.
Yeah, go.
I already said it, but I'll say it again. I think because I think it's really very basic, and again, it gets back to what Bruce Perry talked about. Kids need to be emotionally regulated before anything happens in order to access their brain. So we got to create communities and relationships that are regulating for kids, which means changing a lot of what we do. A lot of what we do are when we see behavior or learning as motivation, then we incentivize and we punish, and that gets in the way of our regulation. So I would say that the first step is, how do we help them regulate? And then the second step is, let's make sure they're engaged in a connected relationship. And I know, Marcos, you worked with Father Greg Boyle in Los Angeles. I love one of his quotes, which is, how else except through connection can people be reminded of their goodness? And what we really want is for kids in these relationships to be reminded of their goodness. And then finally, Yuri Bronfenbrenner said, every kid needs at least one person in their life who's one adult in their life who's irrationally crazy about them. And these are things that these create the doses of relationship that's required for kids' brains to open up, but also for them to really begin to experience themselves as people who have things to contribute, that people that they're connected to their own goodness in a way that oftentimes schools do not allow kids to connect to that because it's so hard and stressful for them.
Thank you. Marcos.
You know, I appreciate the quote from Father Greg Boyle, who I worked very closely with, and I was thinking of a quote of his as well. Something he says is, how much more can we stand in awe of young people and all they have to carry, rather than in judgment for what they are carrying? If I would encourage all of us, right? We talked about the power of co-regulation. My one dream for all young people is to have those positive relationships in their lives. And so, in as much as, for all the folks here as the Friends of the Children who can enter into a young person's life and be that positive force, and moving away from judgment of the parents, of the children, of all that they have to carry, and think about more in awe of their resilience and all that they are trying to do in spite of their circumstances, in spite of the adverse experiences that they've had to face. And that, I think, can help us move the needle forward. I'll pass it to Dr. Davis.
Ooh. Yeah, we came with some theology, some exegesis, some hermeneutics. I can't follow Greg Boyle nor the eloquence of my panel mates here, so I appreciate that. So in thinking about this question, I'm really going to systems and structures, and I see a couple of comments in the chat about the newly elected school board in Chicago and what policymakers are focusing on. So I'll respond to that in part of this question, which is, our policymakers talking to the practitioners and to the people that are doing the work, and you normally hear on the ground, but with the people, with the community, and what does that look like? Currently in Chicago, they're currently doing town halls and conversations with families about Black student success, right? And all these years that Chicago's been working on college attainment and students going to college, the two lowest performing groups in the city are Black males and Black women. And it's like, we haven't been working on this for literally 20 years. It has spanned my entire teaching career is 30 years. And we've been talking about this for 30 years, and the numbers are still terrible. So now we got to think about what these numbers tell us and what we're not doing or who we're not talking to. What are the day-to-day experiences of our young people in any space? Again, how are they welcome? To go back to my colleagues that mentioned, like, who is the adult that is caring for them, caring about them, and speaking to them in a manner that makes them feel valued and wanted? But in the systems and the structural space, to go to Dan's comment about how we all work together. And I think that's key. I think there are neighborhoods in our city where maybe 90% of people feel like they have a connection. They're connected to a church, they're connected to a business, they live there. And this is where Friends of the Children comes in, because you're also talking about that percentage of families that is not rooted anywhere, right? That their roots move, that and that dysregulation in their family is what impacts. So how do we set up systems and communities to receive people in a way that gets them into the, I'm going to say the word pipeline for lack of a better term, but into the space where they can receive care in that way? What does that look like? For our healthcare people, is how do we triage it? What's our intake process look like? So then we can get the mail to the right address, get the supports to the right address. And I think citywide, and I think these are all communities, how does that trickle down? So there might be a policy up high that people think people are communicating, and then the public library has a worker, it has a job that is a rotating door where people leave that job. So now you got to learn someone new. So again, how do adults flow in and out of those spaces, and what does that mean? And what does knowledge management mean? It's a systems and a structure and a leadership issue that we have to figure out to put some better infrastructure around in order to intake and receive people, but also make sure everybody gets what they need. I believe we have everything that we need. I honestly do in Chicago. I think we have the pieces, and we have to coordinate and put those pieces together so we can get it to the families and the caregivers and the young people that need it.
Well, and I think that what you just said about, like, really focused, we want to make sure that we have more kids going to college. We can't have more kids going to college if they're not reading, right? And we are losing kids in early elementary. That's when we're losing kids. If we're not teaching them how to read, if we're not putting all of the supports around kids in the early years, they're gone. We've lost them. We've failed them, right? They didn't give up on us. We have failed them. And what I think that we know, right, it's larger systems things that we have to do, but every child, I think, Doug, that you said, like, needs one person that cares about them and is looking, Marcos, to your point, not saying not what's wrong with you, but what's going on? Something's really upsetting you. And so I want to wrap up with a story about one of the children in our program. Roland is a smart, inquisitive, and charming fifth grader. His smile lights up a room. Roland has seen more hardship in his 10 years on this planet than most of us can even imagine. He hid in a bathtub from a gunfight that broke out during his 8-year-old birthday party. He and his mom have moved countless times for a variety of heartbreaking reasons. A few months ago, he went to school ready to fight. His hoodie was up, his arms were crossed, and he was seething with anger. He alternated between total silent treatment and picking fights with his teachers and his peers. All day long, he was punished for his poor behavior. He spent the majority of the day isolated in the back of the room or in the hallway. And as Doug said earlier, this has sort of just exacerbated his bad feelings. His professional mentor from Friends of the Children, Willie, picked Roland up after school. Roland continued his silent treatment and directed his anger at Willie. When they arrived at the Friends of the Children clubhouse, Michelle, our education specialist, joined Willie and Roland. For almost an hour, he refused to talk to them and threw things at the wall. Willie and Michelle didn't get mad at Roland. They loved on him. They told him they could see that he was very upset, and they were there for him and ready to listen if he was willing and ready to share what was going on. After some time, Roland melted. He shared that he heard that they were about to get evicted again. That's a heavy load for a 10-year-old to have to carry on his shoulders. After he got out his fears and was comforted by Willie and Michelle, Roland sat and read with them for almost an hour. That's what baseline humanitarian support looks like. Today was just the start of the conversation. I encourage you to continue asking and exploring, how do we restore the right to read to all children? Every child can learn how to read. They just need proper support. That's exactly what we do at Friends of the Children. Friends of the Children is a professional mentoring program that is about more than prevention. It's about possibility. At Friends of the Children, we start working with kindergartners and we commit to staying by their and their family side for the long term, for 12 and a half years, no matter what. My hope is that you will choose to support our work so that we can continue to offer children born into the most challenging circumstances with the in-depth, holistic support they need so they can be in a brain state to learn how to read and to ultimately thrive. I want to thank our wonderful panelists and thank each and every one of you for spending the last hour with us. Thank you very much. Take care. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.